In these quiet hours of the night, it's the perfect time to share stories from the heart. How are you feeling today, after a long day? Now, it's time to let go of all your worries. Before we begin, give this video a like, subscribe. For more companionship, share your current mood. Let us know where you are. Let's start our journey together. When you serve in the military, nights on a naval vessel always feel especially long, especially on an old warship. That ship had been in service for over half a century, its hull worn and rusted, and the air always carried a mix of oil and seawater. The daytime noise masked everything, but at night, the entire ship was so quiet that only the occasional hum of the machinery remained, as if the ship itself was whispering secrets no one dared to uncover. I was a conscripted sailor assigned to an old patrol frigate, responsible for the daily operations in the engine room. That night, I was on duty when the chief engineer asked me to check the cooling system in engine room number 3. It had shown some irregularities earlier in the afternoon. The time was 1 o'clock in the morning. The corridors of the ship were narrow and dimly lit, with only the overhead red warning lights faintly flickering, painting the surroundings in a blood-like hue. Carrying my toolbox, I descended the narrow iron ladder. Engine room number 3 was located at the very bottom of the ship, and unlike other engine rooms, it was isolated in a remote corner. Rumor had it that a tragic accident had occurred there years ago. A maintenance worker had been pulled into the machinery during a repair and lost his life instantly. Though it was just a story, every time I passed by that area, a chill would creep up my spine. When I reached the door, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and the room inside was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the machinery's indicator lights. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The cooling system was located at the far end of the room. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the cramped space and revealing walls stained with oil and tangled pipes. As I crouched down to inspect the cooling system, I heard a faint noise. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone knocking on a metal pipe, rhythmic but unsettling. I froze for a moment and looked around. Is anyone there? I called out. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the machinery vibrating, and went back to work. But as soon as I lowered my head again, the noise returned, and this time it was louder. Thump, thump, thump. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the room, where the darkness was deepest, beyond the reach of my flashlight. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to move toward the source of the noise. Who's there? Stop messing around, I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice echoed in the cramped space, sounding hollow and weak. That moment, my flashlight flickered a few times and then went out completely. The entire engine room plunged into darkness, with only the faint blinking of the machinery's indicator lights in the distance. I frantically tapped the flashlight, and the beam came back on. But in that brief moment, when the light returned, I saw something. A figure. It was a blurry silhouette standing at the far end of the room, its head lowered as if staring at the floor. I froze, my mind blank, and for a few seconds, I even forgot to breathe. The figure was wearing a navy blue jumpsuit, identical to the uniforms we wore, but its feet were not touching the ground. I couldn't bear to look any longer. I turned and bolted for the door. My footsteps echoed loudly on the metal floor, but as I neared the ladder, I heard a voice, hello, raspy whisper, "Don't go." The voice was slow and gravelly, as if it came from far away, yet it felt like it was right next to my ear. I didn't dare turn around. I climbed the ladder as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the engine control room. My hands were trembling so much that I nearly dropped the toolbox. The next morning, I told the chief engineer what had happened. His expression darkened, and after a long silence, he finally said, "Don't talk about engine room number 3 again. And don't ever go there alone." I pressed him for answers, but he just shook his head and walked away. From that day on, I never set foot in engine room number 3 again. But that whispering voice, it still haunts my dreams. This story takes place at the Tainan Guanchun Military Training Center in southern Taiwan, where I served as a trainee. At the training center, night guards were required to patrol and sign in at various checkpoints across multiple floors. The rules were strict. We had to visit each checkpoint from the first to the 4th floor and sign our names. Skipping even one checkpoint would result in severe punishment, like extra training or cleaning duties, every night at 10 o'clock. The entire building would plunge into darkness. Only a dim desk lamp remained lit at the guard station, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. While we were equipped with flashlight batons, they were old and unreliable, often flickering or dying without warning. The training center's location in rural Taiwan made it even more eerie. Dense fog would often roll in at night, reducing visibility to mere feet. It was around 1:40 in the morning when my shift began. After signing the logbook and exchanging a few words with the previous guard, who seemed unusually eager to leave, I started my patrol. Beginning from the 1st floor, I methodically worked my way through the checkpoints. The left side room on the 1st floor, the 2nd floor storage room, the 2nd floor bathroom, and so on. The only sounds were my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors until I reached the 3rd floor bathroom. As I approached, I heard 2 distinct male coughs coming from inside. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be on the 3rd floor. All trainees were housed on the 2nd floor for easier supervision. The sound was clear and close, as if someone was standing just behind the door. I thought perhaps it was one of the senior trainees, though I couldn't understand why they'd come all the way up here when there were perfectly good bathrooms on their floor. I decided to wait outside, assuming whoever it was would emerge soon. 5 minutes passed in complete silence. The air felt heavier, colder. I knocked twice on the door, my knuckles barely touching the surface. "Is anyone in there?" My voice sounded small in the darkness. No response. The bathroom lights were off, and through the small gap under the door, I could see no movement, no light, nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Is someone there?" Still nothing. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the doorknob. Just then, I heard the unmistakable sound of running water from one of the sinks. The sound was crystal clear, someone turning on the tap full force. I jerked my hand back instinctively. They must be washing their hands, I reasoned, trying to calm my racing heart. I'll just wait. But even after the water stopped, no one came out. No footsteps, no door opening, just absolute silence. Gathering what little courage I had left, I slowly turned the doorknob, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my blood freeze. Every single stall door was wide open, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The bathroom was completely empty. The sinks were bone dry, I slammed the door shut so hard it echoed through the hallway, scribbled my signature at the checkpoint with trembling hands, and ran down the stairs as fast as I could. By the time I reached the guard station, my watch showed 3 o'clock. I sat there under the dim light, trying to convince myself nothing had happened. The next day, during lunch break, one of the senior trainees, known among us for his sixth sense, shared something that made my skin crawl. The previous night, he and another trainee, Ming, had sneaked up to the rooftop for a cigarette. While they were leaning against the railing, chatting, the senior noticed a dark figure standing by the storage room door, staring intently at Ming. The figure was unnaturally tall, almost touching the ceiling, and completely still except for its head, which slowly turned to follow Ming's every movement. Though it looked vaguely human-shaped, something about its proportions was terribly wrong. The senior, feeling a wave of dread, quickly made up an excuse. I think I heard an officer. Downstairs. We should go. Ming complained about his half-finished cigarette, but the senior practically pushed him toward the stairs. When he glanced back, the figure had silently moved within 10 feet of them, but the worst part came later. Back in the dormitory, the senior saw the figure follow them in. It stood at the foot of Ming's bed all night, its towering form bent over him like a twisted tree. The senior lay awake all night, too terrified to tell Ming what he was seeing. The next morning, Ming began to feel ill. What started as mild cold symptoms quickly escalated. "Why do I feel so cold?" he asked at breakfast, his face ashen. By noon, he could barely walk without supporting himself against the wall. As if all his energy had been drained, the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong, diagnosing it as severe fatigue. But Ming's condition continued to deteriorate. He began having nightmares, waking up screaming about a tall, dark figure trying to drag him into the darkness. Within a week, he had to take medical leave and return home. I later heard that Ming's family took him to a traditional Taoist priest who said something malevolent had attached itself to him. Only after several cleansing rituals did Ming's condition gradually improve. To this day, he refuses to go out at night, and the mere sight of fog sends him into a panic. After this incident spread through the training center, no one dared to go to the rooftop at night anymore. And I stood firm in my decision. I'd rather face punishment than patrol alone in the dark. After all, you never know what might be watching from the shadows, waiting for its next target. This is another story from my time as a conscripted soldier in Kinmen. Our camp was located near Taewu Mountain, an area steeped in history and surrounded by remnants of wartime bunkers and tunnels. The mountain was beautiful during the day, but at night, it became shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant cries of nocturnal animals. One particular night, I was assigned to patrol a section of the camp that bordered the mountain. It was a quiet area with few lights and long stretches of empty roads. My partner for the patrol shift, Private Lee, was a soft-spoken guy who didn't talk much. We were both new to the camp and had heard stories from the older soldiers about strange occurrences near the mountain, but we dismissed them as just campfire tales. As we began our patrol, the night seemed uneventful. The air was cool, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. About halfway through our route, we passed by an old, abandoned guard post. It was a small, concrete structure with shattered windows and rusted doors. Private Lee stopped and pointed toward the post. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look, but saw nothing. "See what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Lee hesitated before saying, "I thought I saw someone standing inside." Looking at us, his words sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off, telling him it was probably just a trick of the light or his imagination. Still, we decided to check it out. Just to be sure, we approached the guard post cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The inside was empty, just as I had expected, but there was something unsettling about the place. The air felt heavy, and there was a faint metallic smell, like rust or old blood. On the floor, we noticed faint footprints leading toward the back of the post, where a narrow path disappeared into the woods. Should we follow it? Lee asked, his voice trembling slightly. I hesitated but nodded. It was our duty to investigate. Even if every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, the path was overgrown and barely visible under the moonlight. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to grow quieter, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling bunker, partially hidden by vines and moss. The entrance was open, revealing a dark tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. Lee and I exchanged uneasy glances. "This wasn't on the map," I said, trying to mask my unease. "Let's take a quick look and head back." We stepped inside, our flashlights illuminating the damp, narrow walls. The air was cold and carried a faint echo of dripping water. As we moved deeper, we noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and words in a language neither of us recognized. The further we went, the stronger the sense of unease grew, as if we were being watched. Suddenly, we heard a faint whisper, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the sound of the dripping water. "Did you hear that?" Lee asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tightly. The whisper grew louder, turning into a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from all around us. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. But as we turned to go back, the tunnel seemed to stretch longer than it had before, the exit now barely a pinprick of light in the distance. Panic set in as we quickened our pace, the whispers now accompanied by the sound of footsteps soft. Deliberate and getting closer, we broke into a run, the light at the end of the tunnel growing brighter with each step. Just as we reached the exit, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I turned, but there was nothing there. Lee and I stumbled out of the bunker, gasping for air. When we looked back, the entrance was gone, just a solid wall of earth where the bunker had been moments ago. The rest of our patrol was a blur. We reported what had happened to our superior, but he dismissed it as a case of overactive imaginations. "That area has been sealed off for years," he said. "There's no bunker there to this day. I can't explain what we saw or experienced that night." Some of the older soldiers later told us about a hidden network of tunnels under Tewu Mountain, used during the war, but abandoned after a series of unexplained incidents. They warned us to stay away from the mountain at night, and I've heeded that advice ever since. Some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried with the past.